Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Philosophy. Tonight, we're wandering into the shadowed corridors of one of literature's most profound minds, Fyodor Dostoevsky, a man who peered into the human soul with such unflinching honesty that his insights still echo through the centuries. Whether you're here to learn something new about the human condition, or simply to let these ideas carry you peacefully towards sleep, you've found exactly the right place. Before we begin our exploration of Dostoevsky's dark wisdom, I'd love it if you could give this video a gentle like. It helps more fellow seekers find their way to these quiet philosophical conversations. And if you enjoy drifting off to discussions about life's deeper questions, consider subscribing to Sleepy Philosophy. Now, pull your blankets a little closer, find that perfect position, and let's step quietly into the complex, sometimes troubling, but ultimately enlightening world of Dostoevsky's philosophy. Picture, if you will, a man hunched over his desk in the pale light of a St. Petersburg winter morning. The year is 1864, and Fyodor Dostoevsky is writing feverishly, his pen scratching across paper as he pours out thoughts that will challenge everything his readers believe about human nature. This isn't the comfortable philosophy of abstract principles or neat moral categories. This is philosophy born from the trenches of human experience, from poverty, imprisonment, exile, and the constant wrestling with questions that have no easy answers. Dostoevsky didn't arrive at his insights through academic study alone, though he was certainly well read. He earned his wisdom through suffering, through watching human beings at their worst and their best, often within the same breath. He understood something that many philosophers miss entirely, that human beings are not rational creatures who occasionally act irrationally, but rather deeply irrational creatures who sometimes manage to act rationally. This understanding forms the foundation of what we might call Dostoevsky's dark wisdom. Not dark in the sense of hopeless or nihilistic, but dark in the way that a deep well is dark, holding truths that can only be reached by descending into uncomfortable depths. His philosophy emerges not from ivory towers, but from the underground, from the places where people reveal who they really are when they think no one is watching. At the heart of Dostoevsky's thinking lies a profound skepticism about human perfectibility. While his contemporaries in the mid-19th century were swept up in optimistic visions of progress, believing that reason, science, and social reform would eventually create a utopian society, Dostoevsky saw something else entirely. He saw that human beings have an almost perverse tendency to act against their own best interests, to choose suffering over comfort, chaos over order, simply to assert their individual will. This insight appears most clearly in his novella Notes from Underground, where the unnamed narrator declares his preference for acting irrationally simply to prove that he can. "I am a sick man," he begins, and in that sickness, Dostoevsky reveals something universal about the human condition. We are all in some sense sick, not physically necessarily, but spiritually, psychologically, morally. We carry within us contradictions that can never be fully resolved, desires that war against each other, impulses that lead us away from happiness, even when we desperately want to be happy. But here's where Dostoevsky's philosophy becomes particularly fascinating for those of us seeking wisdom in the quiet hours before sleep. He doesn't offer this diagnosis as a cause for despair. Instead, he suggests that recognizing our fundamental brokenness is the first step toward genuine wisdom and, paradoxically, toward a kind of redemption. It's only when we stop pretending that we're rational, consistent, morally upright beings that we can begin to understand what we actually are: complex, contradictory, suffering creatures capable of both tremendous cruelty and extraordinary love. This acceptance of human contradiction leads us to one of Dostoevsky's most important concepts: the idea that suffering is not merely an unfortunate byproduct of existence, but an essential component of consciousness itself. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov discovers that His attempts to transcend ordinary morality through an act of murder only plunge him deeper into psychological torment. The suffering that follows isn't punishment imposed from outside. It's the inevitable result of a consciousness confronting its own actions. Dostoevsky understood that suffering serves a purpose beyond mere punishment. It awakens us to reality in ways that comfort never can. When we're comfortable, we can afford to live in illusions about ourselves and others. We can maintain pleasant fictions about human nature, about progress, about the ultimate meaning of existence. But suffering strips away these comfortable lies and forces us to confront what is actually true. This doesn't mean that Dostoevsky glorified suffering or believed we should seek it out. Rather, he recognized that since suffering is inevitable, built into the very structure of conscious existence, we might as well understand what it can teach us. And what it teaches, according to his philosophy, is humility, compassion, and a deeper appreciation for the moments of genuine connection and love that pierce through the darkness of ordinary existence. Consider how this applies to the way we typically approach our own psychological discomfort. Modern culture tends to treat anxiety, sadness, or existential questioning as problems to be solved as quickly as possible. We reach for distractions, medications, or simple solutions that promise to restore us to a state of untroubled happiness. Dostoevsky would suggest that this approach, while understandable, causes us to miss something crucial about what these difficult emotions are trying to tell us. From his perspective, anxiety might be consciousness recognizing the weight of moral responsibility. Sadness might be the soul's appropriate response to the genuine tragedy woven into existence. Existential questioning might be the mind's healthy refusal to accept easy answers to profound questions. Rather than rushing to eliminate these experiences, Dostoevsky's philosophy invites us to sit with them, to listen to what they're revealing about the human condition. This brings us to another central theme in Dostoevsky's dark wisdom: the relationship between freedom and responsibility. Unlike many philosophers who treat freedom as an abstract political or metaphysical concept, Dostoevsky was primarily interested in psychological freedom, the terrifying and wonderful fact that human beings must choose who they will become, often without clear guidance about what the right choice might be. In The Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor argues that most people cannot handle the burden of genuine freedom, that they would rather surrender their autonomy in exchange for security and certainty. This isn't necessarily a criticism of human weakness. Dostoevsky seems to understand why the weight of constant moral choice might feel unbearable. Every decision we make shapes not only our external circumstances, but our internal character. We are, in a very real sense, creating ourselves through our choices, and the responsibility for that creation can feel overwhelming. Yet this same responsibility that terrifies us also represents our greatest dignity as human beings. Unlike other creatures who act primarily from instinct, we have the capacity to choose our responses to any situation. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, often cited Dostoevsky's insight that no external circumstance can determine our internal response. Even in the most constrained circumstances, we retain the freedom to choose our attitude, our inner stance toward what we're experiencing. This psychological freedom comes with what Dostoevsky saw as an inescapable moral dimension. Because we can choose, we are responsible for our choices. Because we are responsible for our choices, we inevitably find ourselves weighing questions of right and wrong, good and evil. And because these questions often don't have clear answers, we experience the anxiety and uncertainty that Dostoevsky saw as fundamental to human consciousness. But rather than trying to escape this moral complexity, his philosophy suggests we should embrace it as the price and privilege of being human. The alternative, surrendering our freedom to external authorities, whether political, religious, or social, might provide temporary relief from the burden of choice, but it also diminishes our humanity. This leads to perhaps the most challenging aspect of Dostoevsky's wisdom: his understanding of evil not as an external force that corrupts otherwise innocent beings, but as a possibility that exists within every human heart. In his novels, the most compelling villains are not monsters, but recognizable human beings who have made a series of choices that led them away from love and toward destruction. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment begins as a young man with noble ideals who wants to help his impoverished family and contribute something meaningful to society. His descent into murder doesn't happen because he's inherently evil, but because he gradually convinces himself that he's exceptional enough to transcend ordinary moral restrictions. Similarly, Ivan Karamazov's intellectual rejection of God's goodness doesn't stem from mere rebelliousness, but from a genuine anguish over the suffering of innocent children. Dostoevsky's insight here is that evil often emerges not from a simple rejection of good, but from a distorted pursuit of it. People rarely choose evil because they love destruction. They choose it because they've convinced themselves that their particular form of destruction serves some higher purpose. This makes evil far more insidious and far more universal than we might prefer to believe. If the capacity for evil exists within every human heart, then moral vigilance becomes not a matter of identifying and condemning the wicked others, but of constant self-examination and humility about our own potential for self-deception and harm. This doesn't lead to moral relativism. Dostoevsky clearly believed in objective moral truth, but it does lead to a kind of moral humility that recognizes how easily any of us might lose our way. As we settle deeper into this exploration, consider how these insights might apply to the way you understand yourself and others. How often do we act against our own best interests, choosing immediate gratification over long-term fulfillment or comfort over growth? How often do we find ourselves making choices that we know, even as we make them, will lead to regret or suffering? Dostoevsky would suggest that these patterns aren't signs of weakness or failure, but inevitable expressions of our contradictory nature as human beings. We are creatures caught between our animal impulses and our spiritual aspirations, between our desire for freedom and our longing for security, between our capacity for love and our tendency toward selfishness. The tension between these opposing forces generates much of the psychological drama that Dostoevsky explored so brilliantly in his fiction. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the tension, nothing can do that, but it can help us approach our own contradictions with greater compassion and wisdom. Instead of berating ourselves for our inconsistencies, we might learn to see them as natural expressions of the complex beings we are. Instead of expecting ourselves or others to achieve perfect rationality or moral consistency, we might develop the patience to work with the messy, contradictory reality of human nature. This acceptance doesn't mean resignation to moral mediocrity. Rather, it creates the conditions for genuine growth and change. When we stop wasting energy on impossible standards of perfection, we can focus on the gradual, difficult work of becoming slightly more conscious, slightly more compassionate, slightly more honest about who we are and who we might become. This gradual transformation is what Dostoevsky understood as the real work of being human. It's not the dramatic conversion experience that literature sometimes promises, where a character suddenly becomes enlightened and all their problems disappear. Instead, it's the slow, often painful process of becoming more aware of our own motivations, more honest about our limitations, and more willing to extend grace to ourselves and others as we stumble forward through the complexities of existence. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin represents Dostoevsky's exploration of what pure goodness might look like in a corrupt world. Mishkin is genuinely innocent, genuinely compassionate, genuinely free from the petty jealousies and manipulations that drive most of the other characters. Yet rather than transforming the world around him, his goodness often seems to make situations worse. People don't know how to respond to authentic virtue, and his presence exposes the ugliness in others in ways that create more conflict rather than less. This isn't Dostoevsky arguing against goodness, but rather illustrating how complex moral action becomes in a fallen world. Even our best intentions can have unintended consequences. Even our most sincere attempts to help others can sometimes cause harm. This doesn't mean we should stop trying to be good, but it does mean we need to hold our goodness lightly, with humility about our capacity to understand the full implications of our actions. As you lie there listening to these ideas, you might notice how they resonate with your own experience of trying to navigate relationships, career decisions, or personal growth. How often have you discovered that doing the right thing was more complicated than you initially thought? How often have you found that your attempts to help someone actually made their situation worse? Or that your efforts to improve yourself created new problems you hadn't anticipated? Dostoevsky's philosophy doesn't provide easy solutions to these dilemmas, but it does offer something perhaps more valuable: the recognition that these dilemmas are universal. You're not uniquely flawed for finding moral action difficult. You're not unusually selfish for sometimes choosing your own comfort over others' needs. You're not exceptionally weak for struggling with temptations that you know will ultimately harm you. You're simply human, participating in the common condition that has challenged and perplexed people across all cultures and centuries. This recognition can be profoundly liberating. When we stop expecting ourselves to be something other than human, we can begin to work skillfully with what we actually are. We can develop strategies for managing our contradictory impulses rather than pretending they don't exist. We can create structures in our lives that support our better angels while acknowledging the reality of our worse ones. Consider how this might apply to something as simple as your daily routine. Most self-help approaches encourage us to rely on willpower and motivation to maintain healthy habits. But Dostoevsky's understanding of human nature suggests that willpower and motivation are unreliable resources that will inevitably fail us at crucial moments. A wiser approach might involve designing our environment and schedules in ways that make good choices easier and bad choices harder, accepting that we can't always count on our rational minds to override our immediate desires. This practical wisdom flows naturally from Dostoevsky's deeper insight about the relationship between reason and emotion in human decision-making. The Enlightenment tradition that dominated his era placed tremendous faith in reason's ability to guide human behavior. If people could just be educated properly, if they could just understand their true interests clearly enough, they would naturally choose what was best for themselves and others. But Dostoevsky observed that people often act against their rational interests, not because they don't understand those interests, but because other forces within them are stronger than rational understanding. The underground man chooses to act irrationally, precisely because he understands his rational interests perfectly well. He rebels against reason not from ignorance, but from a deeper need to assert his individual will, even when that assertion leads to suffering. This doesn't mean that reason is useless, but rather that it needs to be understood as one voice among many in the complex symphony of human motivation. Emotions, instincts, unconscious drives, social pressures, spiritual longings, all of these influence our choices alongside whatever rational analysis we might undertake. Wisdom involves learning to listen to all these voices rather than privileging reason alone. From this perspective, the goal of personal development isn't to achieve perfect rational control over our lives, but to develop what we might call emotional and spiritual intelligence alongside our intellectual capacities. This means learning to recognize and work with our emotional patterns rather than simply trying to override them. It means understanding how our past experiences shape our present reactions, not so we can eliminate that influence, but so we can respond to it more consciously. Dostoevsky was particularly interested in how childhood experiences and family dynamics continue to influence us throughout our lives. In The Brothers Karamazov, each of the brothers represents a different response to their shared experience of growing up with an abusive, neglectful father. Dmitri becomes impulsive and passionate, seeking intense experiences to fill the emotional void left by inadequate parenting. Ivan becomes intellectually brilliant but emotionally cold, using his mind as a fortress against feeling too deeply. Alyosha finds refuge in religious faith, channeling his need for love into devotion to God and service to others. None of these responses is presented as simply right or wrong. Each represents a comprehensible adaptation to impossible circumstances, yet each also carries its own costs and limitations. Dmitri's passion leads him into destructive relationships and financial ruin. Ivan's intellectualism isolates him from genuine human connection. Alyosha's faith, while beautiful, sometimes prevents him from fully engaging with the messy realities of secular life. The novel suggests that healing and growth come not from choosing the correct response to trauma, but from gradually becoming conscious of how our past continues to shape our present, and then slowly expanding our range of possible responses. This is subtle work that can't be rushed or forced. It requires the kind of patient self-observation that Dostoevsky himself practiced in his own life and modelled in his fiction. As these ideas settle around you, like a comfortable blanket, you might reflect on your own patterns of response to challenge and difficulty. What strategies did you develop as a child to cope with whatever pain or uncertainty you encountered? How do those strategies serve you now, and how do they limit you? What would it mean to hold these patterns with compassion rather than judgment, seeing them as evidence of your younger self's creativity and resilience rather than as character flaws to be eliminated? This compassionate self-observation is central to what Dostoevsky understood as the path toward greater freedom. We can't change what we're not aware of, but awareness alone doesn't automatically create change. Between awareness and transformation lies a middle ground of patient, gentle work with ourselves, the kind of work that happens not in dramatic moments of insight, but in countless small choices to respond slightly differently than we have before. This middle path between unconscious reactivity and forced change reflects Dostoevsky's broader understanding of how spiritual growth actually occurs. Unlike many religious traditions that emphasize sudden conversion or enlightenment experiences, Dostoevsky's characters typically move toward redemption through gradual, often painful processes of recognition and acceptance. Raskolnikov's journey from murder to confession spans most of crime and punishment, and even his final acceptance of love comes only after he has fully acknowledged the reality of what he has done. Similarly, in The Brothers Karamazov, Dmitri's transformation begins not with a religious revelation, but with his willingness to accept responsibility for his actions, even when he's technically innocent of the specific crime he's accused of. He recognizes that while he didn't murder his father, he had certainly wished his father dead many times. His redemption comes through accepting the moral weight of those wishes, rather than hiding behind legal technicalities. This suggests that authentic spiritual development requires a kind of radical honesty about ourselves that goes beyond mere confession of specific wrongdoings. It involves acknowledging the full range of our capacity for both good and evil, love and hatred, wisdom and foolishness. Only when we stop trying to maintain an idealized self-image can we begin to work with who we actually are. Such honesty can feel threatening because it challenges the stories we tell ourselves about being fundamentally good people who occasionally make mistakes. Dostoevsky's psychology suggests instead that we are fundamentally complex people capable of both tremendous good and tremendous harm, depending on circumstances and choices. This view is neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but rather realistic about the full spectrum of human possibility. From this realistic foundation, genuine compassion becomes possible, not the sentimental kindness that flows from seeing others as basically good, but the deeper compassion that can embrace others even when we recognize their capacity for harm. This compassion extends to ourselves as well, allowing us to work with our own darkness rather than spending our energy trying to prove it doesn't exist. The night deepens around us as we continue this exploration, and perhaps you're beginning to feel that gentle pull towards sleep. That's perfectly natural and even appropriate, because Dostoevsky's wisdom works on us gradually, seeping into consciousness like water into soil. These aren't ideas that need to be grasped immediately or applied with urgent efficiency. They're more like seeds that can be planted in the quiet spaces of the mind and allowed to grow slowly over time. This gradual approach to wisdom reflects something profound about how human beings actually change and grow. We live in a culture that often promises instant transformation, breakthrough moments, life-changing revelations, complete personality makeovers achieved through the right technique or insight. But Dostoevsky's observations of human nature suggest that real change happens much more slowly and quietly, often in ways we don't immediately recognize. Think about how you learned to walk as a child. There wasn't a single moment when you suddenly mastered the skill. Instead, there were countless small attempts, failures, adjustments, and gradual improvements. Your nervous system slowly learned to coordinate balance, muscle control, and forward momentum until walking became natural, and that psychological and spiritual development follows a similar pattern. This unconscious, Dostoevsky understood, is why his characters often experience what seems like regression or setbacks even as they move toward greater wisdom. Raskolnikov doesn't simply confess his crime and immediately become a better person. He confesses, then struggles with doubt and resentment. He accepts Sonia's love, then pushes her away. Even in the novel's final pages, his transformation is presented as a beginning rather than a completion, the start of a gradual renewal that will take years to unfold fully. This patience with the slowness of change extends to how Dostoevsky viewed the relationship between knowledge and behavior. Many of his characters possess remarkable insight into their own psychology and motivations. They can analyze their feelings with sophistication and articulate their moral principles with eloquence. Yet this intellectual understanding doesn't automatically translate into different choices or behaviors. The underground man, for instance, demonstrates extraordinary self-awareness. He understands exactly why he acts as he does, can predict his own responses to various situations, and even recognizes the futility of his patterns. But this knowledge doesn't free him from those patterns. If anything, his consciousness of his own contradictions seems to trap him more completely within them. This suggests that intellectual insight, while valuable, is only one component of genuine transformation. Dostoevsky recognized that we are embodied beings whose thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are interconnected in complex ways. Changing how we think about ourselves might be necessary for growth, but it's rarely sufficient. Real change requires engaging with the full spectrum of our human experience: physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual. Consider how this applies to something as common as breaking unwanted habits. Most people approach habit change primarily through conscious decision-making. They identify the habit they want to eliminate, understand why it's harmful, resolve to stop, and then rely on willpower to maintain their resolution. But Dostoevsky's understanding of human psychology suggests why this approach so often fails. Our habits are rarely maintained purely by conscious choice. They're supported by emotional patterns, environmental cues, social relationships, physical sensations, and unconscious beliefs about ourselves and the world. To change a habit effectively, we need to work with all these levels, not just the rational mind. This is slow, patient work that requires attention to the subtle ways our whole being participates in maintaining our current patterns. This holistic approach to change is one reason why Dostoevsky was so interested in the role of love in human transformation. Not romantic love necessarily, though that appears in his novels, but the broader phenomenon of genuine care and connection between human beings. He observed that people often change more readily in the context of loving relationships than through solitary effort or intellectual insight alone. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov's movement toward redemption is catalyzed by Sonia's unwavering love and acceptance. She doesn't try to argue him out of his guilt or convince him to confess through logical reasoning. Instead, she simply continues to see him as a human being worthy of love, despite his crimes. This consistent recognition gradually awakens in him the capacity to see himself differently. Similarly, in The Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha's influence on others comes not from his theological arguments or moral teachings, but from his genuine attention and care. People feel seen and accepted in his presence in ways that create space for them to acknowledge their own struggles without shame. This acknowledgement often becomes the foundation for gradual change. This points to something important about the social dimension of personal growth. While much contemporary self-help focuses on individual effort and private transformation, Dostoevsky understood that we become who we are largely through our relationships with others. We learn about ourselves by seeing how others respond to us. We develop our capacity for love by being loved. We discover our potential for goodness by encountering others who recognize and call forth that potential. This doesn't mean we're passive recipients of others' influence. Rather, it suggests that personal development and relational development are inextricably linked. As we work on becoming more conscious, honest, and compassionate ourselves, we create conditions that invite others to grow as well. As we learn to extend grace to our own contradictions and limitations, we become more capable of accepting others with their complexities intact. From this perspective, the goal isn't to achieve some ideal state of individual perfection, but to participate more fully in the ongoing human project of creating conditions where consciousness, love, and wisdom can flourish. This is inherently collaborative work that can't be accomplished in isolation. As you rest there in the gentle darkness, you might notice how these ideas resonate with your own experiences of growth and change. Perhaps you can recall times when someone's patient love or acceptance created space for you to acknowledge parts of yourself you had been hiding or denying, or moments when your own compassionate attention seemed to help another person feel safer about revealing their struggles or fears. These moments of genuine human connection are what Dostoevsky saw as the antidote to the isolation and alienation that characterize so much of modern life. The underground man's suffering stems largely from his inability to connect authentically with others. He approaches relationships as battles to be won or performances to be managed rather than opportunities for mutual recognition and care. This defensive approach to human connection is something Dostoevsky traced to what he saw as a fundamental misunderstanding about human nature. When we believe that showing vulnerability or admitting uncertainty makes us weak or unworthy, we naturally try to present ourselves as more competent, confident, or virtuous than we actually feel. But this performance requires tremendous energy to maintain and ultimately distances us from the very connection we crave. The alternative Dostoevsky explored involves what we might call strategic vulnerability, the willingness to let others see us as we actually are, complete with our doubts, fears, and contradictions. This doesn't mean oversharing or burdening others with every detail of our inner life. Rather, it means dropping the exhausting pretense that we have everything figured out and allowing space for authentic encounter. Such authenticity can feel risky because it makes us dependent on others' responses in new ways. When we're performing competence or virtue, we can tell ourselves that any negative response from others reflects their limitations rather than ours. But when we show up authentically, their responses touch something more real and therefore more vulnerable in us. Yet Dostoevsky's experience and observation suggested that this risk is worth taking because authentic connection, even when it includes conflict or disappointment, nourishes us in ways that performative relationships cannot. We need to be known and accepted as we are, not as we think we should be. This need is so fundamental that we'll often choose relationships that include genuine conflict over relationships that are pleasant but superficial. This explains why some of Dostoevsky's most compelling characters have intense, complicated relationships rather than easy, harmonious ones. Raskolnikov and Sonia, Dmitri and Grushenka, Ivan and Alyosha, these pairs challenge each other, frustrate each other, even hurt each other at times, but they also see each other with unusual clarity and accept each other with remarkable grace. Their relationships are difficult but real in ways that simple compatibility could never achieve. The same principle applies to our relationship with ourselves. Dostoevsky understood that self-acceptance doesn't mean self-satisfaction or complacency. It means developing the capacity to acknowledge our full reality, including the parts we'd prefer to ignore or change, without losing our fundamental sense of worth and possibility. This self-acceptance becomes the foundation for genuine self-improvement. When we're not spending energy trying to prove that we're already acceptable, we can focus that energy on the actual work of growth. When we're not defending against recognition of our limitations, we can learn from our mistakes rather than simply repeating them with better justifications. Consider how this might apply to something as simple as meditation or prayer practice. Many people approach these disciplines with the unconscious goal of becoming the kind of person who meditates or prays regularly. Someone disciplined, spiritual, peaceful, but this goal-oriented approach often creates internal pressure that makes the practice feel like another performance rather than a space for honest encounter with reality. Dostoevsky's approach would suggest beginning instead with curiosity about what actually happens when we sit quietly with ourselves. What thoughts arise? What emotions surface? What physical sensations demand attention? Rather than trying to achieve a particular state or become a particular kind of person, we might simply observe what's already present with as much kindness and interest as we can manage. This observational stance gradually develops what contemplative traditions call witness consciousness, the capacity to notice our experience without being completely identified with it. We begin to recognize that we are larger than any particular thought, emotion, or sensation that arises. This recognition doesn't eliminate difficult experiences, but it creates space around them that makes them more workable. The development of witness consciousness is central to what Dostoevsky understood as the path toward greater freedom. When we're completely identified with our immediate reactions, our anger, our fear, our desires, we have very little choice about how we respond. The emotion arises and we act from it automatically. But when we can observe our reactions as they occur, we create a small space of choice about how we want to respond. This space of choice is tiny at first and easily overwhelmed by strong emotions or external pressures. But like physical strength, it grows with gentle, consistent exercise. Each time we notice our reaction, without immediately acting from it, we strengthen our capacity to choose our responses rather than simply having them. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally detached or intellectually controlling. Dostoevsky was deeply suspicious of approaches that try to rise above human feeling rather than working through it. His characters who attempt to transcend their emotions through pure reason, like Ivan Karamazov, often end up more trapped by those emotions than characters who acknowledge and engage with their feelings more directly. The goal isn't to eliminate emotional reactivity, but to develop a more conscious relationship with it. We can feel angry without immediately acting from that anger. We can notice fear without being paralyzed by it. we can experience desire without being compelled by it. This conscious engagement with our emotional life allows us to respond to situations from our full wisdom rather than just our immediate reactions. As the night grows deeper around you, perhaps you can feel this witness consciousness naturally arising. The simple act of listening to these ideas rather than trying to immediately apply them creates a space of observation. You're noticing thoughts and reactions to what you're hearing without necessarily needing to do anything with them right away. This receptive, observational stance is one of the most practical gifts we can give ourselves. In our action-oriented culture, we often feel pressure to immediately translate every insight into a plan for change. But Dostoevsky's wisdom suggests that sometimes the most important work happens in this receptive space, the quiet noticing that precedes conscious choice. From this space, we can begin to recognize patterns in our thinking and feeling that we might otherwise miss. We can notice how certain thoughts reliably trigger certain emotions, how certain emotions tend to lead to certain behaviors, how certain behaviors reinforce certain beliefs about ourselves and others. This pattern recognition doesn't require us to immediately change anything, but it gives us information we can use when we're ready to make different choices. This patient observation also helps us recognize the difference between thoughts and reality. Many of our thoughts about ourselves, others, and life in general are habitual interpretations rather than accurate perceptions. When we're identified with these thoughts, they seem obviously true. But when we can observe them arising and passing away, we begin to see them as one possible perspective among many. The underground man's suffering comes largely from his inability to recognize this difference. His bitter, cynical thoughts about human nature and social life feel to him like profound insights into reality rather than expressions of his own wounded psychology. Because he can't see his thoughts as thoughts, he remains trapped within a particular way of interpreting experience that ensures his continued isolation and misery. Developing the capacity to observe our thought patterns with some detachment is liberating because it reveals that we have more choice about our inner life than we often realize. We can't control what thoughts arise, but we can influence which thoughts we give our attention to and which interpretations we choose to believe and act from. This inner work naturally affects our outer relationships and circumstances, but in subtle ways that unfold over time rather than through dramatic external changes. As we become more conscious of our own patterns, we naturally become more understanding of others' patterns. As we develop patience with our own contradictions, we find more patience available for others' contradictions as well. This gradual expansion of understanding and compassion is what Dostoevsky saw as the real fruit of philosophical and spiritual development. Not the achievement of some perfect state, but the ongoing cultivation of greater consciousness, love, and wisdom in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. The beauty of this approach is that it can be practiced anywhere, at any time, with whatever material life presents us. Whether we're dealing with major life transitions or ordinary daily frustrations, the same principles apply. Observe with curiosity, accept what we find without judgment, and respond from our deepest wisdom rather than our immediate reactions. As these ideas settle into the quiet spaces of your awareness, allow yourself to rest in the recognition that this work is already happening naturally. Simply by listening with an open, receptive attention, you're practicing the kind of consciousness that Dostoevsky understood as the foundation of wisdom. There's nothing you need to figure out or fix right now. The darkness around you is patient and kind, holding space for whatever thoughts and feelings arise and pass away. In this gentle darkness, surrounded by the quiet wisdom of one who understood human nature so deeply, let yourself drift toward whatever rest awaits you. The insights we've explored together will continue to work in the depths of your awareness, not as urgent demands for change, but as seeds of understanding that will grow in their own time, in their own way. Sleep well, knowing that consciousness itself is a gift, and that even your struggles and contradictions are part of the beautiful complexity of being human. The gentle rhythm of your breathing as you listen mirrors something Dostoevsky understood about the natural cycles of human experience. Just as sleep and waking alternate in their eternal dance, so too do the movements of consciousness and unconsciousness, awareness and forgetting, clarity and confusion. He recognized that wisdom doesn't arrive as a permanent state we achieve and then maintain, but rather as moments of insight that arise, illuminate something briefly, and then fade back into the ordinary flow of daily life. This cyclical understanding of human development appears throughout his work, perhaps most clearly in the way his characters experience what we might call spiritual seasons. They move through periods of darkness and light, confusion and clarity, despair and hope, not in a linear progression towards some final destination, but in spirals that circle back through familiar territory while gradually deepening their understanding of themselves and existence. Consider Dmitry Karamazov's journey through what he calls his dark night of the soul. His transformation doesn't follow a neat arc from ignorance to enlightenment. Instead, he cycles through periods of wild passion, deep remorse, tentative hope, crushing despair, and fragile renewal. Each cycle brings him slightly closer to self-knowledge, but the process itself remains fundamentally mysterious and unpredictable. This cyclical view offers profound comfort for anyone who has struggled with personal growth and found themselves seemingly returning to old patterns they thought they had overcome. Dostoevsky would suggest that these apparent setbacks are not failures, but natural expressions of how consciousness actually develops. We don't transcend our human nature, we learn to work with it more skillfully. The seasons of our inner life follow rhythms that are often invisible to us while we're living through them. What feels like stagnation might actually be a period of necessary germination. What seems like regression might be the psyche's way of revisiting unfinished business with new resources and understanding. What appears to be pointless suffering might be the slow work of developing capacities we didn't know we needed. This seasonal understanding extends to how Dostoevsky viewed the relationship between individual development and historical change. He lived through a period of tremendous social upheaval in Russia, witnessing the abolition of serfdom, the rise of revolutionary movements, and the collision between traditional religious values and modern secular ideologies. Rather than seeing these changes as simply progressive or regressive, he recognized them as expressions of deeper cycles in human consciousness. Each generation, he observed, tends to rebel against the solutions their parents found to life's fundamental questions, only to eventually rediscover some version of those same truths through their own experience. The pendulum swings from tradition to rebellion and back toward integration, but never quite returning to exactly the same place. Each swing brings new understanding, even when the surface forms appear similar. This perspective can help us hold our own historical moments with greater equanimity. The cultural confusion and moral uncertainty that characterize our time are not unique catastrophes, but expressions of perennial human struggles taking contemporary forms. The questions we grapple with about meaning, identity, relationship, and purpose are the same questions human beings have always faced, dressed in the particular circumstances of our era. From this view, our personal struggles with anxiety, depression, relationship difficulties, or existential uncertainty are not signs that something has gone uniquely wrong with us or our time. They are expressions of the human condition itself, the inevitable result of consciousness trying to make sense of existence in a complex and often confusing world. This doesn't minimize the reality of psychological suffering or suggest we should simply accept difficult emotions without seeking help or making changes. Rather, it provides a larger context that can help us approach our struggles with greater patience and less self-judgment. When we understand that confusion and difficulty are natural parts of the human experience, rather than personal failures, we can work with them more effectively. Dostoevsky was particularly interested in how this understanding applies to what we now call existential anxiety, the deep unease that can arise when we contemplate questions about the meaning and purpose of existence. Many of his characters experience moments of overwhelming dread when they confront the apparent arbitrariness of life, the inevitability of death, or the absence of clear moral guidelines. Rather than treating these moments as psychological problems to be solved, Dostoevsky saw them as encounters with fundamental aspects of the human condition. The anxiety arises not because something is wrong with us, but because we are conscious beings trying to navigate existence without absolute certainty about what it all means or how we should live. This existential anxiety often intensifies during life transitions, adolescence, midlife, retirement, illness, loss, when our usual ways of understanding ourselves and our place in the world no longer seem adequate. These transitions can feel like crises, and in some sense they are, but they're also opportunities for consciousness to expand and deepen its understanding of what it means to be human. The key insight Dostoevsky offers is that we don't need to resolve existential anxiety by finding definitive answers to life's ultimate questions. The anxiety itself, when approached with curiosity rather than resistance, can become a doorway to greater authenticity and compassion. When we stop trying to eliminate uncertainty, we can begin to discover how to live wisely within it. This shift from seeking absolute answers to learning to live skillfully with uncertainty represents a fundamental maturation in consciousness. Young people often approach life's big questions with the expectation that there must be clear, definitive answers somewhere, in religion, philosophy, science, or personal experience. The discovery that such answers are not readily available can initially feel devastating. But Dostoevsky suggests that this disappointment, while painful, opens the door to a more mature and ultimately more satisfying relationship with existence. When we release the demand for absolute certainty, we become free to engage more fully with the actual texture of lived experience. We can appreciate beauty without needing to explain it completely. We can love others without needing to understand them perfectly. We can act ethically without having resolved all moral dilemmas theoretically. This mature acceptance of uncertainty doesn't lead to nihilism or moral relativism. Instead, it creates space for what Dostoevsky called active love, a love that engages with the world as it actually is rather than as we think it should be. This kind of love doesn't require perfect understanding or complete agreement. It simply requires the willingness to remain present and engaged even when clarity is limited. Active love appears throughout Dostoevsky's novels in characters who choose to care for others despite not fully understanding their motivations or being able to guarantee positive outcomes. Sonia loves Raskolnikov without being able to explain or excuse his crime. Alyosha offers attention and support to people whose problems he cannot solve. These characters embody a way of being in the world that finds meaning through engagement rather than through comprehension. This approach to love and meaning-making has profound implications for how we understand personal relationships. Much contemporary relationship advice focuses on communication techniques, compatibility assessments, and problem-solving strategies. While these can be helpful, Dostoevsky's psychology points to something deeper: the capacity to remain lovingly present with others, even when we cannot fully understand or change them. Think about the people in your life whom you love most deeply. Chances are your love for them isn't based primarily on your ability to comprehend their psychology or predict their behavior. Instead, it flows from something more mysterious: a recognition of their essential humanity, an appreciation for their unique way of being in the world, a willingness to share in their joys and sorrows, regardless of whether you can make sense of them. This kind of love requires what we might call emotional courage, the willingness to remain open and engaged even when the outcome is uncertain. It means choosing connection over control, presence over understanding, acceptance over judgment. Such choices don't come naturally to most of us. They require practice and patience with ourselves as we learn to tolerate the vulnerability that genuine love entails. The vulnerability of love extends beyond romantic relationships to encompass our connection with life itself. To live fully means to care about things that are fragile and impermanent, people who will die, projects that may fail, ideals that may be compromised. The more deeply we allow ourselves to care, the more we open ourselves to potential loss and disappointment. Dostoevsky understood this paradox intimately through his own experience of loss and suffering. He lost his first wife to tuberculosis, struggled with epilepsy throughout his life, and faced financial difficulties that forced him to write under enormous pressure. Yet rather than becoming bitter or withdrawn, he seemed to develop greater capacity for compassion and deeper appreciation for the preciousness of human connection. His characters often discover that their greatest suffering becomes the source of their greatest wisdom and compassion. Raskolnikov's Crime and Punishment teach him about the reality of moral responsibility and the possibility of redemption. Dmitri's wild excesses lead him to understand the difference between genuine and artificial passion. Ivan's intellectual rebellion against God eventually circles back to a deeper appreciation for mystery and faith. This pattern suggests that consciousness has a natural tendency toward integration, toward finding ways to incorporate difficult experiences into a larger understanding of what it means to be human. We don't simply recover from trauma or overcome challenges. We find ways to weave them into the ongoing story of who we are becoming. This integrative capacity is one of the most remarkable features of human psychology. Unlike physical wounds that heal by returning to their original state, psychological wounds often heal by creating something new, greater empathy, deeper wisdom, stronger resilience, or more authentic self-knowledge. The scar tissue of consciousness is often more flexible and interesting than the original unmarked surface. As you rest there in the gentle darkness, you might reflect on your own experiences of integration and growth. Can you identify times when something that initially felt purely negative eventually contributed to positive changes in your understanding or character? Moments when loss taught you about love? When failure revealed hidden strengths? When confusion preceded clarity? This doesn't mean we should seek out suffering or romanticize difficulty. Dostoevsky never suggested that pain is inherently good or that we should welcome hardship. Rather, he observed that since difficulty is inevitable in human life, we might as well learn to work with it skillfully rather than simply enduring it or trying to escape it. Working skillfully with difficulty involves developing what contemplative traditions call the long view, the capacity to hold immediate experience within a larger temporal and spiritual context. When we're in the midst of a crisis, it's natural to become completely absorbed in the immediate circumstances. Our entire world can shrink to the dimensions of the current problem, making it difficult to remember that this too shall pass. The long view doesn't minimize present suffering or suggest that we should detach from current circumstances. Instead, it provides a larger container that can hold both the reality of present difficulty and the knowledge that circumstances are constantly changing. This perspective can help us respond to challenges with greater wisdom and less reactivity. Dostoevsky cultivated this long view through his deep engagement with Russian Orthodox Christianity, but the same perspective can be developed through secular means: meditation, therapy, philosophy, art, or simply the accumulated wisdom that comes from living through multiple cycles of difficulty and renewal. What matters is not the particular framework we use, but the capacity to hold our immediate experience within a larger understanding of human existence. This larger understanding naturally leads to what Dostoevsky saw as one of the highest expressions of human development, the capacity for genuine compassion. Not sentimental pity or condescending charity, but the deep recognition that all conscious beings struggle with the fundamental challenges of existence. When we truly understand that everyone we meet is grappling with questions about meaning, mortality, love, and purpose, it becomes much harder to dismiss or judge others harshly. Compassion, in Dostoevsky's understanding, is not primarily an emotion, but a way of seeing. It's the recognition that the person who annoys us, the stranger who seems so different from us, the public figure whose views we find reprehensible, is fundamentally engaged in the same project we are, trying to figure out how to live as a conscious being in a complex world. This doesn't mean we have to agree with everyone's conclusions or approve of all their choices. Compassion can coexist with clear moral judgment and appropriate boundaries. But it does mean extending to others the same patient understanding we hope others will extend to us when we make mistakes or fall short of our own ideals. The practice of compassion begins with ourselves. Most of us are far harsher critics of our own thoughts, feelings, and behaviours than we would be of a good friend facing similar challenges. We expect ourselves to be consistently rational, always kind, perpetually motivated, and quickly able to overcome any psychological difficulties we encounter. When we inevitably fail to meet these unrealistic standards, we often respond with self-criticism that would be considered cruel if directed toward another person. Dostoevsky's psychology suggests that this self-criticism is not only unkind but counterproductive. When we're spending energy defending against our own harsh internal judgment, we have less energy available for actual growth and change. Self-compassion, paradoxically, creates more space for genuine self-improvement than self-criticism does. This might seem counterintuitive if you've been raised to believe that self-discipline requires internal toughness. But consider how you respond when someone approaches your mistakes with patience and understanding versus when they approach them with criticism and judgment. Most people find it easier to acknowledge errors and make changes in an atmosphere of acceptance rather than condemnation. The same principle applies to our relationship with ourselves. When we can observe our patterns and limitations with curiosity rather than judgment, we create internal conditions that support genuine insight and change. This doesn't mean becoming self-indulgent or avoiding responsibility for our actions. Rather, it means treating ourselves with the same basic kindness and patience we would offer to someone we care about who is struggling with similar issues. This compassionate self-observation is particularly important when working with what Dostoevsky called the underground aspects of human nature. The petty jealousies, selfish impulses, vengeful fantasies, and other thoughts and feelings we'd prefer not to acknowledge. The underground man's suffering comes largely from his inability to accept these aspects of himself, which leads him to express them in increasingly distorted and destructive ways. The alternative is not to eliminate these impulses. Dostoevsky believed this was impossible, but to develop a conscious relationship with them. When we can acknowledge our capacity for selfishness without being consumed by shame about it, we're less likely to act selfishly unconsciously. When we can admit our jealous feelings without judging ourselves as terrible people, we can respond to those feelings more thoughtfully. This conscious integration of our shadow aspects is delicate work that requires both honesty and gentleness. We need enough honesty to acknowledge what we'd prefer to deny about ourselves, but enough gentleness to avoid becoming overwhelmed by self-condemnation. This balance develops gradually through practice and often benefits from the support of trusted friends, therapists, or spiritual teachers who can help us maintain perspective. The fruit of this inner work is greater authenticity and spontaneity in our relationships with others. When we're not spending energy trying to hide aspects of ourselves from our own awareness, we naturally become more present and responsive to what's actually happening in our interactions. We're less likely to project our own unacknowledged issues onto others and more likely to see them clearly. This clarity of perception is what Dostoevsky valued most highly in human relationships. His most admirable characters are not those who are perfect or even particularly virtuous, but those who can see themselves and others with unusual honesty and respond to what they see with appropriate care. They don't try to fix or improve others, but they also don't withdraw from engagement when relationships become challenging. This quality of present, non-judgmental attention is something we can cultivate in small ways throughout our daily lives. In conversations, we can practice listening to what the other person is actually saying rather than preparing our response or judging their perspective. In conflicts, we can try to understand the other person's experience before defending our own position. In moments of irritation or disappointment, we can pause to consider what factors might be contributing to the other person's behaviour. These small practices of attention and understanding gradually develop what we might call relational wisdom, the capacity to navigate human connections with greater skill and compassion. This wisdom doesn't eliminate relationship difficulties, but it helps us work with those difficulties more constructively. We become less reactive to others' limitations and more responsive to opportunities for genuine connection. As the night continues to enfold you in its patient embrace, you might notice how naturally this quality of compassionate attention can extend to your own experience in this moment. There's no need to judge your thoughts, analyze your feelings, or evaluate whether you're listening correctly. You can simply rest in the gentle awareness that notices whatever arises without needing to do anything about it. This receptive awareness is itself a form of meditation, not the concentrated, effortful kind that requires special techniques or postures, but the natural mindfulness that emerges when we stop trying to control our experience and allow ourselves to simply be present with whatever is happening. Dostoevsky understood this kind of presence as essential to both self-knowledge and genuine love. In the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the gentle rhythm of your breathing, in the soft darkness that holds you safely, the wisdom we've been exploring together continues its slow, patient work, not demanding immediate application or dramatic transformation, but simply seeding your consciousness with possibilities for greater understanding, compassion, and authentic engagement with the beautiful complexity of being human. Throughout the insights of this profound Russian writer, born from his own struggles with suffering and uncertainty, offer not solutions, but companionship for the journey. They remind us that we are not alone in our questions, not unique in our contradictions, not failures because we haven't achieved perfect clarity or consistency. We are simply human beings, participating in the ancient conversation about what it means to live consciously in a mysterious world. As sleep begins to claim you, let these ideas settle like gentle snow, each insight finding its own place in the landscape of your awareness. There's no urgency here, no pressure to remember everything or apply it immediately. The darkness is patient, the night is long, and wisdom works best when it's allowed to unfold naturally, in its own time, in its own way. Rest now in the knowledge that consciousness itself is a gift, that your questions and struggles are part of something larger and more beautiful than you might have imagined, and that even in sleep, the deep work of understanding and integration continues. Tomorrow will bring its own opportunities for practice, its own moments for choosing compassion over judgment, presence over control, authentic engagement over comfortable withdrawal. But for now, there is only this gentle darkness, this quiet breathing, this soft letting go into whatever dreams or silence await you. Sleep well, dear fellow traveller, knowing that in wrestling with these profound questions about human nature and meaning, you participate in the ongoing human project of creating a more conscious, compassionate world. The gentle wisdom of Dostoevsky's understanding of human nature extends into territories that modern psychology is only beginning to explore, the realm of what he called living life versus merely thinking about it. In his novels, he drew a crucial distinction between characters who experience existence directly and those who construct elaborate intellectual frameworks to avoid genuine encounter with reality. This distinction offers profound insights for anyone seeking authentic personal development rather than mere self-improvement strategies. Consider the difference between reading about love and actually loving someone, between studying theories of courage and acting courageously in a specific situation, between understanding compassion intellectually and extending genuine care to someone whose suffering touches your heart. Dostoevsky observed that many people, particularly those with sophisticated minds, can become trapped in the realm of abstract understanding, mistaking knowledge about life for actual living. The underground man exemplifies this trap perfectly. He possesses remarkable psychological insight and can analyze human behavior with devastating accuracy. Yet this very intelligence becomes a prison that separates him from direct experience. He thinks about relationships instead of having them, analyzes feelings instead of feeling them, contemplates action instead of acting. His consciousness becomes so self-referential that it loses contact with the immediate reality it was meant to engage. This pattern appears frequently in contemporary culture, where we often consume endless content about personal growth, spiritual development, and psychological healing without necessarily engaging in the actual practices that create transformation. We can become experts on mindfulness without developing the capacity for present moment awareness, authorities on emotional intelligence while remaining disconnected from our own feelings, or philosophers of authentic living while avoiding the vulnerability that authenticity requires. Dostoevsky would suggest that this intellectual approach to personal development, while valuable in some ways, can become a sophisticated form of avoidance. When we focus primarily on understanding ourselves, rather than actually being ourselves, we maintain a safe distance from the immediacy of lived experience. We can analyze our patterns without changing them, discuss our limitations without confronting them, and study wisdom traditions without embodying their insights. The alternative he explores through his most compelling characters involves what we might call embodied awareness, a way of engaging with consciousness that includes but transcends intellectual understanding. This embodied awareness emerges not through more thinking about experience, but through deeper participation in it. It requires the willingness to feel our emotions fully, rather than just understanding them conceptually, to act from our values even when we can't predict the outcomes, to love others despite not being able to control their responses. This shift from thinking about life to living it consciously often begins with what Dostoevsky called active suffering, the willingness to engage directly with difficult experiences rather than immediately trying to understand, fix, or escape them. When we encounter pain, loss, disappointment, or uncertainty, our habitual response is often to move as quickly as possible to some form of resolution. We want to understand why this happened, figure out how to prevent it from happening again, or find meaning that makes the difficulty worthwhile. While these responses are natural and sometimes helpful, they can also prevent us from receiving whatever gifts the difficult experience might offer. Active suffering involves staying present with challenging circumstances long enough to let them teach us what we need to learn, even when that learning doesn't come in the form of clear insights or practical solutions. This doesn't mean wallowing in pain or avoiding appropriate action when action is called for. Rather, it means developing the capacity to be fully present with whatever we're experiencing while maintaining openness to possibilities we haven't yet imagined. Sometimes, the most transformative learning happens not through understanding why something occurred, but through discovering how we can respond to it with greater wisdom and compassion. Consider how this applies to something as common as interpersonal conflict. When someone we care about says or does something that hurts us, our immediate impulse is often to understand their motivation, defend our position, or strategize about how to prevent similar conflicts in the future. While these responses have their place, they can also prevent us from fully receiving the information the conflict is offering about our own patterns, needs, and areas for growth. Active suffering in this context might involve staying present with the hurt feelings without immediately trying to resolve them, noticing what the conflict reveals about our expectations and attachments, and remaining open to the possibility that this difficulty might be pointing toward greater authenticity or deeper connection. This kind of presence requires considerable courage because it means tolerating uncertainty about outcomes while trusting that engagement itself has value. Dostoevsky was particularly interested in how this principle applies to our relationship with our own psychological patterns and limitations. Most approaches to personal development focus on identifying problematic patterns and then working to change them. While this can be effective, it can also create an adversarial relationship with aspects of ourselves that might actually contain important information or energy. Instead of immediately trying to eliminate anxiety, depression, anger, or other difficult emotions, Dostoevsky's psychology suggests first learning to be present with them fully enough to understand what they're communicating. Anxiety might be alerting us to genuine dangers we've been ignoring. Depression might be the psyche's way of forcing us to slow down and reconsider our priorities. Anger might be pointing toward boundaries that need to be established or values that need to be defended. This doesn't mean that difficult emotions should never be addressed or that psychological suffering should be romanticized. Rather, it suggests that our difficult experiences often contain intelligence that becomes available only when we're willing to engage with them directly, rather than immediately trying to transcend or eliminate them. As you rest there in the gentle darkness, you might notice this principle operating naturally in your own awareness. Rather than trying to control your thoughts or achieve a particular state of mind, you can simply observe what arises with curiosity and patience. Some thoughts may be pleasant, others uncomfortable, still others neutral. Each one carries information about your current inner landscape without necessarily requiring immediate action or analysis. This receptive awareness is itself a form of active suffering in Dostoevsky's sense. The willingness to be present with whatever consciousness presents without immediately moving to judgment, interpretation, or modification. It's a practice that can be cultivated in any moment, whether we're dealing with major life challenges or simply noticing the ordinary flow of thoughts and sensations that accompany everyday experience. The development of this capacity for presence has profound implications for how we approach goals and ambitions. Much contemporary goal setting focuses on defining desired outcomes and then creating strategies to achieve them. While this approach has obvious practical value, Dostoevsky's psychology points to something that's often overlooked: the importance of being fully present with the journey itself rather than just focused on reaching the destination. When we're primarily oriented toward future outcomes, we can miss much of the information and opportunity that's available in present circumstances. We might achieve our goals, but discover that the person who achieves them is not substantially different from the person who set them. The external circumstances change, but the internal patterns that created the need for those particular goals remain unchanged. Dostoevsky observed this pattern in characters who seek transformation through external achievements, wealth, status, recognition, or even spiritual accomplishments, only to discover that these achievements don't provide the fulfillment they expected. The problem isn't with the achievements themselves, but with the assumption that changing external circumstances will automatically create internal transformation. The alternative approach involves what we might call process-oriented development, focusing as much attention on how we pursue goals as on what goals we pursue. This means paying attention to what qualities of character we're developing through our efforts, what we're learning about ourselves along the way, and how our relationships with others are being affected by our choices. From this perspective, the specific outcomes we achieve become less important than the person we become through pursuing them. A career change that doesn't lead to the expected increase in satisfaction might still be valuable if it teaches us something important about our values or reveals capacities we didn't know we possessed. A relationship that ends in disappointment might contribute to our growth if it helps us understand our patterns more clearly or develop greater capacity for vulnerability and resilience. This process orientation doesn't eliminate the importance of outcomes or suggest that all goals are equally valuable. Rather, it places external achievements within a larger context of personal development and authentic self-expression. We can work towards specific goals while remaining open to whatever learning and growth the journey itself provides. This flexibility becomes particularly important when we encounter obstacles or setbacks in our pursuits. From a purely outcome-oriented perspective, obstacles are problems to be solved or overcome as efficiently as possible. But from Dostoevsky's perspective, obstacles often contain exactly the information or challenge we need for our next stage of development. The career setback that forces us to reconsider our priorities, the relationship conflict that reveals our unconscious patterns, the health challenge that shifts our perspective on what matters most. These difficulties, while genuinely challenging, often serve as catalysts for growth that wouldn't occur through success alone. This doesn't mean we should seek out obstacles or avoid working to overcome challenges, but rather that we can approach difficulties with curiosity about what they might be offering, alongside our efforts to resolve them. This balanced approach to challenge and growth reflects a deeper principle in Dostoevsky's philosophy: the idea that consciousness develops through engagement with polarity rather than through the elimination of tension. Instead of trying to achieve states of permanent peace, clarity, or happiness, his characters find meaning and growth through learning to navigate the dynamic tensions that characterize human existence. The tension between individual desires and social responsibilities, between rational analysis and emotional truth, between accepting what is and working for change. These polarities can't be resolved through choosing one side over the other. Instead, wisdom involves learning to hold both sides simultaneously, responding to each situation from a place that honors the legitimate claims of competing values. Consider how this applies to the common struggle between self-care and service to others. Many people experience this as an either-or choice. Either we focus on our own needs and development, or we dedicate ourselves to helping others. But Dostoevsky's psychology suggests that this apparent conflict often dissolves when we recognize that genuine self-care actually enhances our capacity to serve others effectively, while authentic service often contributes to our own growth and fulfillment. The key is learning to discern in each specific situation what kind of response honors both our own well-being and our connections with others. Sometimes this means saying no to requests that would genuinely harm our capacity to function effectively. Other times it means stretching beyond our comfort zones to offer support that calls forth qualities we're ready to develop. The wisdom lies not in following fixed rules, but in developing the sensitivity to recognize what each moment requires. This dynamic responsiveness is what Dostoevsky called living truth, as opposed to abstract truth. Abstract truths can be stated in general principles that apply across situations. Honesty is good. Kindness is valuable. Courage is important. Living truths emerge through the specific application of these principles to particular circumstances, which often requires balancing competing values and navigating complex relationships. For example, the abstract truth that honesty is valuable doesn't automatically tell us how to respond when honesty might genuinely harm someone we care about. The abstract truth that we should help others doesn't specify how to respond when helping one person means disappointing another. Living truth emerges through wrestling with these specific complexities rather than through applying predetermined formulas. This wrestling with moral complexity in real situations is what Dostoevsky saw as the essence of ethical development. We don't become more ethical by learning better principles or developing stronger willpower, though both of these can be helpful. We become more ethical by engaging repeatedly with situations that require us to discern what love, justice, and wisdom actually look like in specific circumstances. This experiential approach to ethics has profound implications for how we understand personal responsibility and social engagement. Rather than focusing primarily on avoiding mistakes or following correct procedures, we can focus on developing the capacity to respond thoughtfully and caringly to whatever situations arise. This doesn't eliminate the importance of moral principles, but it places them within the context of lived relationship and practical wisdom. The night deepens around us as we continue this exploration, and perhaps you can feel how these ideas naturally translate into the quality of attention you're bringing to this very moment. You're not just receiving information about Dostoevsky's philosophy, you're practicing the kind of receptive, non-judgmental awareness that his psychology recognizes as fundamental to genuine insight and growth. This present moment awareness is where all transformation actually occurs. We can plan for change, analyze our patterns, and set intentions for the future, but the actual shift from one way of being to another happens in specific moments of choice. When we're fully present, we can recognize these choice points and respond from our deepest wisdom rather than our habitual patterns. These choice points often appear in surprisingly ordinary moments. How we respond to an interruption, what tone of voice we use when we're tired, whether we really listen when someone is speaking to us, how we treat ourselves when we make a mistake. The accumulation of these small choices gradually shapes who we become in ways that are often more significant than dramatic life changes or peak experiences. Dostoevsky understood that character is formed through countless small acts of choosing rather than through single moments of heroic decision-making. The person who consistently chooses patience in minor irritations develops a capacity for patience that will be available in major challenges. The person who practices honesty in small matters builds the strength to be truthful when the stakes are high. This attention to the small choices of daily life transforms ordinary activities into opportunities for spiritual practice. Washing dishes becomes a chance to practice mindfulness. Commuting becomes time for developing patience. Conversations become opportunities to practice listening and compassion. From this perspective, every moment offers the possibility of growth and greater consciousness. This democratization of spiritual development is one of Dostoevsky's most valuable contributions to our understanding of personal growth. We don't need special circumstances, extraordinary experiences, or exotic practices to develop wisdom and compassion. We simply need to bring greater awareness and intentionality to whatever we're already doing. The mother caring for young children, the office worker navigating workplace politics, the student struggling with challenging material, the retiree facing questions about meaning and purpose. Each of these ordinary situations offers rich opportunities for developing the qualities that Dostoevsky valued most: consciousness, compassion, courage, and authentic engagement with reality. This ordinariness of spiritual development also means that we don't need to wait for perfect conditions to begin practicing greater awareness and intentionality. We don't need to resolve all our psychological issues, achieve financial security, or find the ideal living situation before we can start paying attention to how we're showing up in each moment. The practice itself gradually creates the conditions that support further growth. As you rest there in the patient darkness, breathing gently and allowing these ideas to settle in their own natural rhythm, you're already engaging in this practice of present moment awareness. There's no need to do anything special or achieve any particular state, simply noticing what's here, the quality of your breathing, the feeling of being supported by whatever you're resting on, the gentle flow of thoughts and sensations, is itself a form of meditation that cultivates the consciousness Dostoevsky understood as essential to genuine wisdom. This natural awareness is always available, regardless of our external circumstances or internal states. Whether we're experiencing clarity or confusion, peace or agitation, joy or sorrow, the capacity to simply notice what's present remains constant. This noticing doesn't require us to change or fix anything. It simply offers a stable reference point from which we can respond more consciously to whatever arises. From this foundation of present moment awareness, all of Dostoevsky's insights about human nature, moral development, and authentic living become not just intellectual concepts, but lived possibilities. The recognition of our own contradictions becomes a doorway to greater self-compassion. The acceptance of uncertainty becomes a source of freedom rather than anxiety. The willingness to suffer actively becomes a path to wisdom and resilience. These transformations don't happen quickly or dramatically. They unfold gradually through countless moments of choosing awareness over unconsciousness, compassion over judgment, engagement over withdrawal. Each choice strengthens our capacity for the next choice, creating positive cycles that gradually reshape both our inner experience and our outer relationships. The beauty of this approach is that it meets us wherever we are. Whether we're dealing with major life transitions or ordinary daily challenges, whether we're feeling strong and capable or vulnerable and uncertain, the same principles apply. Notice what's present, respond from our deepest wisdom, and trust that consciousness itself is working toward greater understanding and love. In the gentle darkness that surrounds you now, these principles are already at work. Your willingness to listen with an open heart, to consider new perspectives without immediately judging them, to rest in uncertainty without demanding immediate answers. All of this demonstrates the kind of consciousness that Dostoevsky understood as the foundation of genuine wisdom. As sleep begins to call you more insistently, allow yourself to surrender to that call without resistance. The insights we've explored together will continue their quiet work in the depths of your awareness, not as urgent demands for change, but as seeds of possibility that will grow in their own time and way. There's nothing you need to remember or apply immediately. The darkness itself is teacher enough, holding space for whatever understanding wants to emerge naturally. Rest now in the knowledge that your very willingness to engage with these profound questions about human nature and authentic living is itself a form of spiritual practice. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to embody whatever wisdom has taken root, new chances to choose consciousness over automatic reaction, new moments to practice the kind of active love that Dostoevsky saw as humanity's highest possibility. But for now, there is only this gentle breathing, this quiet letting go, this soft surrender to whatever dreams or silence await you. Sleep peacefully, knowing that consciousness itself is a gift, and that even your struggles and contradictions are part of the beautiful complexity of being human. In wrestling with these deep questions, you participate in the eternal human conversation about what it means to live with awareness, authenticity, and love. The wisdom we've been exploring together leads us naturally to one of Dostoevsky's most profound insights about the nature of human connection and isolation. He understood that our deepest suffering often stems not from external circumstances, but from what he called spiritual solitary confinement, the prison we create when we become convinced that our particular struggles, fears, and contradictions are uniquely shameful or unforgivable. In the flickering candlelight of his St. Petersburg study, Dostoevsky wrote about characters who believed themselves to be fundamentally different from other human beings, either elevated above ordinary morality or condemned below it. This sense of separation whether rooted in superiority or shame, becomes a source of profound anguish that no external achievement or comfort can touch. The underground man suffers not because his life lacks material comforts, but because he has convinced himself that his inner landscape is so twisted and pathetic that genuine connection with others is impossible. Yet Dostoevsky discovered something remarkable through his own experience of suffering and through his careful observation of human nature. The very experiences we believe make us unlovable or incomprehensible to others are often the experiences that connect us most deeply to our shared humanity. The shame we carry about our petty jealousies, our moments of cowardice, our selfish impulses, our failures of love and understanding, these are not evidence of our unique inadequacy, but expressions of the universal human condition. Consider how often we suffer in silence over thoughts and feelings we assume others don't experience. We might be tormented by anxiety about our competence while assuming everyone else feels naturally confident. We might struggle with feelings of emptiness or meaninglessness while imagining that others have discovered some secret to fulfillment that has eluded us. We might wrestle with difficult emotions toward people we're supposed to love unconditionally, parents, children, spouses, and conclude that we must be particularly selfish or damaged. Dostoevsky's genius lay in his ability to articulate these hidden struggles with such honesty and precision that readers recognize their own secret experiences reflected in his characters. When we encounter Raskolnikov's anguish over his capacity for violence, or Ivan Karamazov's rage at the apparent injustice of existence, or Dmitri's confusion about the difference between genuine and manufactured emotion, we often feel a shock of recognition. This person understands something I thought was mine alone. This recognition has a profoundly healing quality because it breaks through the isolation that intensifies psychological suffering. When we discover that our private struggles are part of the common human experience, they don't disappear, but they lose their power to convince us that we are fundamentally flawed or alone. The anxiety remains anxiety, but it's no longer evidence that something is uniquely wrong with us. The sadness remains sadness, but it's no longer proof that we lack some essential capacity for happiness that others possess. This shift from isolation to connection doesn't require us to share our struggles publicly or seek constant reassurance from others. Instead, it involves developing what we might call a sense of human solidarity, the quiet recognition that everyone we encounter is wrestling with questions about meaning, identity, love, and mortality, even when their external circumstances seem comfortable or their public personas appear confident. From this perspective, the businessman who seems completely focused on profit might be secretly wondering whether his work contributes anything meaningful to the world. The parent who appears to have everything figured out might be privately questioning whether they're raising their children wisely. The friend who always seems cheerful and optimistic might be struggling with doubts about their own worth or purpose. We can't know the specific nature of others' inner lives, but we can trust that everyone carries some version of the universal human burdens. This trust in shared struggle naturally gives rise to what Dostoevsky considered the highest form of human love, compassion that doesn't require complete understanding or perfect compatibility. When we recognize that others are fellow travelers on the difficult journey of consciousness, we can extend care and patience even to those whose particular struggles manifest in ways we find challenging or incomprehensible. The colleague who seems arrogant might be defending against deep insecurities. The friend who withdraws when we need support might be overwhelmed by their own emotional needs. The family member who criticizes our choices might be expressing their own fears about change and uncertainty. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior or eliminate the need for appropriate boundaries, but it provides a context that makes authentic relationship possible, even across significant differences. This compassionate understanding extends most importantly to our relationship with ourselves. When we can recognize our own difficulties as expressions of universal human challenges rather than evidence of personal failure, we create internal conditions that support genuine growth and healing. The part of us that feels anxious about our competence can be met with the same patience we would offer a friend facing similar doubts. The part of us that sometimes feels empty or meaningless can be held with the same compassion we would extend to anyone struggling with questions about purpose and significance. This internal compassion is not a form of self-indulgence or excuse-making. Rather, it's a practical recognition that harsh self-judgment typically creates more psychological suffering without producing meaningful change. When we are spending energy defending against our own critical internal voices, we have less energy available for the actual work of understanding and transformation. Consider how this applies to something as common as procrastination. Most people who struggle with procrastination also struggle with self-criticism about procrastination, creating a cycle where the shame about avoiding tasks becomes another reason to avoid them. The task itself might require 2 hours of focused effort, but the emotional energy spent berating ourselves for not doing it can consume days or weeks. Dostoevsky's approach would suggest beginning with curiosity rather than judgment. What is the procrastination communicating? Is the task genuinely important, or are we avoiding it because we think we should want to do it, rather than because we actually want to do it? Are we avoiding the possibility of doing it imperfectly? Are we overwhelmed by other commitments and trying to do too much? Is the task connected to values that genuinely matter to us, or are we trying to meet someone else's expectations? This kind of gentle inquiry often reveals information that makes procrastination unnecessary. Sometimes we discover that the task isn't actually important to us, and we can let it go without guilt. Sometimes we realize that we're avoiding it because we've set unrealistic standards for how well it needs to be done. Sometimes we find that we're trying to complete it at a time when we don't have adequate energy or focus, and rescheduling it eliminates the struggle. When procrastination persists despite this kind of inquiry, it often points toward deeper questions about values, priorities, or life direction that deserve attention in their own right. The procrastination becomes not a character flaw to be overcome, but a messenger pointing toward aspects of our lives that need care and consideration. This respectful, curious approach to our own patterns reflects a broader principle in Dostoevsky's psychology: the idea that our difficulties often contain intelligence that becomes available when we stop fighting them and start listening to them. This doesn't mean we should never work to change problematic patterns, but rather that understanding often precedes effective change. And understanding requires a quality of attention that's incompatible with harsh judgment. As you rest there in the gentle darkness, you might notice how this principle applies naturally to your current experience. Rather than judging whether you're listening correctly, relaxing properly, or thinking appropriate thoughts, you can simply observe whatever is present with friendly curiosity. What thoughts are arising? What emotions are flowing through awareness? What physical sensations are calling for attention? This non-judgmental observation is itself a form of the internal compassion that Dostoevsky understood as essential to psychological and spiritual development. It creates space around our experience rather than identifying completely with it. We begin to recognize that we are larger than any particular thought, emotion, or sensation that arises. This recognition doesn't eliminate difficult experiences, but it provides a stable foundation from which we can respond to them more wisely. The development of this witness consciousness, the capacity to observe our experience without being overwhelmed by it, naturally leads to greater freedom in how we respond to challenging situations. When we're not completely identified with our immediate reactions, we have more choice about which aspects of our experience we want to act from and which aspects we want to simply acknowledge without expressing. For example, we might notice feelings of irritation arising in a conversation without immediately expressing that irritation. This doesn't mean suppressing or denying the feeling, but rather creating a small space between the feeling and our response that allows us to consider how we want to engage. Sometimes, the irritation carries important information about boundaries that need to be established. Sometimes it's more about our own stress or fatigue than about the other person's behaviour. Sometimes it points toward miscommunications that can be addressed directly. This capacity for conscious response rather than automatic reaction is what Dostoevsky called true freedom. Not the absence of constraints or difficulties, but the ability to choose our relationship to whatever constraints and difficulties we encounter. We can't control what happens to us, but we have significant influence over how we interpret and respond to what happens. This freedom is particularly important in our relationships with others, where automatic reactions often create cycles of misunderstanding and conflict that serve no one's interests. When someone says something that triggers our defensiveness, our immediate impulse might be to defend our position or attack theirs. But if we can recognize the defensiveness as it arises, we might choose instead to ask questions that help us understand their perspective, or to acknowledge the valid concerns in what they're saying, or simply to pause until we can respond from a calmer place. These small choices to respond consciously rather than react automatically, gradually, transform the quality of our relationships. Others begin to experience us as more present, more trustworthy, and easier to communicate with. Conflicts become opportunities for deeper understanding rather than battles to be won or lost. Even when disagreements persist, they can be held within a context of mutual respect and care. This transformation in our external relationships reflects and reinforces changes in our internal landscape. As we develop greater patience with others' limitations and contradictions, we naturally become more accepting of our own. As we learn to listen deeply to what others are really trying to communicate beneath their surface words, we become better at hearing what our own emotions and impulses are trying to tell us. This reciprocal relationship between self-understanding and understanding of others is central to what Dostoevsky saw as the path of human development. We don't become wise in isolation and then apply that wisdom to our relationships. Rather, we develop wisdom through the ongoing practice of trying to love ourselves and others more skillfully, learning from our mistakes and gradually expanding our capacity for patience, honesty, and genuine care. This practice-based approach to wisdom differs significantly from more academic or theoretical approaches to personal development. Instead of trying to understand general principles about human nature and then apply them to specific situations, we start with specific situations, our actual relationships, challenges, and choices, and gradually extract principles from our lived experience. The mother learning to balance her own needs with her children's needs develops wisdom about love and sacrifice through daily practice, not through reading about it. The person recovering from addiction learns about the nature of willpower and habit through repeated experiences of choosing recovery over relapse. The individual facing a major life transition discovers truths about identity and change by actually navigating the uncertainty and fear that transitions evoke. This experiential wisdom often differs in subtle but important ways from theoretical knowledge about the same topics. Someone who has learned about patience through years of caring for an aging parent understands something about the virtue that can't be captured in philosophical treatises. Someone who has discovered their capacity for courage by facing a serious illness knows something about human resilience that goes beyond psychological theories about coping. Dostoevsky valued this kind of lived wisdom above all other forms of knowledge because it's inseparable from character development. When we learn through direct experience, the learning becomes integrated into who we are, rather than remaining external information we happen to possess. We don't just know about compassion, we become more compassionate. We don't just understand forgiveness intellectually, we develop the actual capacity to forgive. This integration of knowledge and character is what makes certain people naturally wise in ways that have little to do with their formal education or intellectual achievements. The grandmother whose advice consistently proves helpful, the friend whose presence provides comfort during difficult times, the colleague who seems to navigate complex situations with unusual grace. These people have typically developed their wisdom through years of conscious engagement with life's challenges. Their wisdom often expresses itself not through elaborate explanations or sophisticated analyses, but through simple responses that somehow address the heart of whatever situation they're facing. They know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer advice and when to simply listen, when to push gently for growth, and when to provide unconditional acceptance. This kind of practical wisdom emerges gradually through what Dostoevsky called the school of suffering, not because suffering itself is valuable, but because conscious engagement with difficulty often produces insights and capacities that can't be developed through comfort alone. The person who has worked through their own depression often becomes particularly skilled at recognizing and supporting others who are struggling with similar challenges. The individual who has faced financial hardship typically develops a deeper appreciation for security and generosity than someone who has never experienced scarcity. This doesn't mean we should seek out suffering or that all difficulties automatically produce wisdom. Rather, it suggests that since challenges are inevitable in human life, we might as well approach them in ways that maximize whatever learning and growth they might offer. This involves bringing conscious attention to our experiences of difficulty rather than simply trying to get through them as quickly as possible. The night deepens around us as we explore these themes, and perhaps you can sense how they relate to whatever challenges you've faced in your own life. The difficulties that seemed purely negative at the time, the relationships that ended painfully, the projects that failed despite your best efforts, the losses that left you feeling empty or confused. These experiences may have contributed to your current capacity for empathy, resilience, or wisdom in ways that are only now becoming apparent. This doesn't mean that everything happens for a reason in some predetermined sense, or that we should feel grateful for experiences that caused genuine harm. Rather, it suggests that consciousness has a remarkable capacity for finding meaning and value, even in circumstances that initially seem purely destructive. This meaning-making ability is one of our most distinctly human characteristics and one of our most powerful resources for healing and growth. The recognition that difficult experiences can contribute to our development doesn't eliminate their pain or make them easier to bear while we're going through them, but it can provide a larger context that helps us approach current challenges with greater patience and curiosity. Instead of seeing every difficulty as evidence that something has gone wrong, we might view some challenges as opportunities to develop qualities or insights we didn't know we needed. This shift in perspective often transforms our relationship to uncertainty and change. Instead of seeing unpredictability as a threat to be controlled or avoided, we might begin to recognize it as a natural feature of existence that keeps life interesting and creates opportunities for growth that wouldn't be possible in a completely stable environment. The job loss that initially feels like a catastrophe might become the catalyst for discovering work that's more aligned with our values. The health challenge that disrupts our routine might lead to lifestyle changes that improve our overall well-being. The end of a relationship that seemed devastating might create space for developing a more authentic sense of self or for forming connections that are more genuinely supportive. This doesn't mean adopting a naive optimism that assumes everything will work out perfectly, or denying the genuine difficulty of major life transitions. Rather, it involves cultivating what we might call mature hope, the recognition that while we can't control what happens to us, we do have significant influence over how we respond to what happens, and that our responses often determine whether experiences ultimately contribute to our flourishing or our diminishment. This mature hope is grounded not in wishful thinking, but in realistic assessment of human resilience and adaptability. Throughout history, people have survived and even thrived in circumstances that initially seemed impossible to bear. They've found ways to create meaning and beauty in the midst of war, poverty, illness, and loss. They've discovered sources of strength and wisdom they didn't know they possessed when faced with challenges that demanded more than they thought they could give. This historical perspective can provide comfort and guidance when we're facing our own difficulties. We're not the first people to struggle with questions about purpose and meaning, to feel overwhelmed by responsibility, to wonder whether we have what it takes to handle what life is asking of us. Others have faced similar challenges and found ways through them. Their experiences don't guarantee that we'll find the same solutions, but they suggest that solutions are possible and that the process of seeking them often transforms us in valuable ways. As you rest in the patient darkness, breathing gently and allowing these ideas to settle in their own natural rhythm, you might reflect on your own experiences of resilience and adaptation. Can you remember times when you handled challenges better than you expected to? Moments when you discovered inner resources you didn't know were available? Situations where something that initially seemed like pure loss eventually contributed to growth or positive change in unexpected ways? These memories can serve as reminders of your own capacity for wisdom and resilience, not as reasons to become complacent about current challenges, but as evidence that you've successfully navigated difficulty before and can likely do so again. The specific solutions you found in previous situations may not apply to current circumstances, but the underlying capacity for finding solutions, adapting to change, and growing through challenge remains constant. This confidence in our own resilience doesn't eliminate the need for support from others or careful attention to our own needs during difficult times. Rather, it provides a foundation of basic trust in our ability to handle whatever comes, that makes it easier to ask for help when we need it and to take appropriate care of ourselves without becoming overwhelmed by anxiety about the future. From this foundation of mature hope and self-trust, we can approach both opportunities and challenges with greater equanimity. We don't need to achieve perfect clarity about the right path forward before taking action, nor do we need to guarantee positive outcomes before engaging wholeheartedly with whatever we're called to do. We can act from our best current understanding while remaining open to new information and willing to adjust course as circumstances change. This flexibility and openness are particularly important in our contemporary world, where the pace of change often makes long-term planning difficult, and where many traditional sources of guidance, religious institutions, stable career paths, clear social roles, provide less structure and certainty than they once did. In such an environment, the capacity to navigate uncertainty with wisdom and grace becomes more valuable than the ability to follow predetermined formulas for success. Dostoevsky anticipated many of these contemporary challenges through his exploration of characters who found themselves caught between traditional ways of life that no longer seemed viable and modern approaches that hadn't yet proven their worth. His characters often struggle with what we now call existential anxiety, the deep unease that can arise when familiar structures of meaning and identity begin to dissolve without clear replacements emerging. Rather than offering simple solutions to this modern predicament, Dostoevsky explored how people might learn to find meaning and direction through direct engagement with their actual circumstances, rather than through adherence to abstract ideologies or inherited traditions. His most admirable characters develop what we might call existential courage, the willingness to create meaning through their choices and relationships, even when they can't rely on external authorities to validate those choices. This existential courage doesn't require dramatic gestures or heroic actions. It can be expressed through something as simple as choosing to listen carefully to a friend who needs support, treating a difficult colleague with patience and respect, or pursuing work that feels meaningful, even when it doesn't provide conventional markers of success. What matters is not the external significance of our choices, but the authenticity and consciousness we bring to making them. The development of this kind of authentic engagement with life often begins with small acts of honesty, acknowledging what we actually care about, rather than what we think we should care about, recognizing what genuinely energizes us, rather than what looks impressive to others, admitting what we don't understand, rather than pretending to have clarity we lack. These small acts of honesty gradually create space for larger expressions of authenticity in our work, relationships, and life direction. As sleep begins to call more insistently, drawing you toward whatever dreams or silence await, allow yourself to rest in the recognition that this movement toward greater authenticity is already happening naturally. Your willingness to engage with these profound questions about human nature and meaning, your capacity to listen with an open heart to ideas that challenge conventional assumptions, your patience with complexity and ambiguity, all of this demonstrates the kind of consciousness that Dostoevsky understood as the foundation of wisdom and authentic living. There's no need to rush toward dramatic changes or immediate applications of these insights. The most profound transformations often happen gradually and quietly, through countless small choices to respond with slightly more awareness, slightly more compassion, slightly more courage than we managed yesterday. Each choice strengthens our capacity for the next choice, creating positive cycles that gradually reshape both our inner experience and our outer relationships in ways that serve not only our own flourishing, but the flourishing of everyone whose lives we touch. Rest now in the gentle darkness, knowing that consciousness itself is working toward greater understanding and love, and that your own struggles and questions are part of something larger and more beautiful than you might have imagined. The wisdom we've explored together will continue its quiet work in the depths of your awareness, not as urgent demands for change, but as seeds of possibility that will grow in their own time and way. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice whatever understanding has taken root, new chances to choose presence over distraction, authenticity over performance, love over fear. But for now, there is only this soft breathing, this gentle letting go, this peaceful surrender to the mystery that holds us all. Sleep well, dear friend, in the knowledge that your very existence is a contribution to the ongoing human conversation about what it means to live with consciousness, courage, and love. The gentle wisdom that flows through Dostoevsky's understanding of human nature brings us to perhaps his most challenging yet liberating insight: the recognition that moral and spiritual development cannot be achieved through willpower alone, but requires what he called active surrender, a paradoxical combination of earnest effort and profound acceptance of our fundamental limitations. This insight emerges most clearly in his exploration of characters who exhaust themselves trying to achieve perfection through sheer determination, only to discover that their very striving has become another form of spiritual pride. Consider Alyosha Karamazov, often viewed as Dostoevsky's most spiritually advanced character. What makes Alyosha compelling is not his moral purity, though he is genuinely good-hearted, but his capacity to hold his own spiritual aspirations lightly. He seeks to serve God and love others authentically, yet he doesn't torture himself when he falls short of his ideals. This lightness of touch allows him to respond to each situation freshly, rather than from the burden of trying to maintain a perfect spiritual reputation, even in his own eyes. This quality of spiritual lightness stands in stark contrast to the exhausting self-improvement projects that characterize so much contemporary personal development. We often approach our growth with the same goal-oriented intensity that we bring to professional achievements, measuring progress, comparing ourselves to others. becoming frustrated when transformation doesn't occur on our preferred timeline. But Dostoevsky observed that this very intensity can become an obstacle to the growth we seek. When we're primarily focused on becoming better people, we can inadvertently create an internal division between our current imperfect selves and our future ideal selves. This division generates a subtle form of self-rejection that actually impedes growth. We're so busy trying to transcend who we are that we never fully inhabit who we are, and authentic development can only occur from a foundation of genuine self-acceptance. This doesn't mean becoming complacent about our limitations or abandoning efforts to grow and improve. And rather, it involves recognizing that growth happens most naturally when we're not gripping it so tightly. Like trying to fall asleep, the harder we try, the more elusive sleep becomes. Similarly, the qualities we most want to develop, patience, compassion, wisdom, courage, often emerge more readily when we focus on creating conditions that support their natural development rather than forcing their appearance. What are these supportive conditions? Primarily, they involve cultivating curiosity about our current experience rather than judgment about it. When we notice ourselves being impatient, instead of immediately criticizing our impatience or forcing ourselves to be patient, we might explore what the impatience is revealing about our expectations, our stress levels, or our underlying values. Often this exploration naturally leads to greater patience without our having to manufacture it artificially. Similarly, when we find ourselves being critical or judgmental, instead of judging ourselves for being judgmental, which creates an infinite loop of self-criticism, we might investigate what fears or vulnerabilities are driving the judgmental thoughts. Frequently, our harshest criticisms of others reflect our own areas of insecurity or shame. Understanding this connection often softens both our self-judgment and our judgment of others organically. This investigative approach to personal growth reflects Dostoevsky's deeper understanding that most of our psychological and spiritual difficulties stem not from having the wrong thoughts or feelings, but from our relationship to those thoughts and feelings. The problem isn't that we sometimes feel angry, jealous, afraid, or confused. These are natural human emotions that contain important information about our needs and boundaries. The problem arises when we believe these feelings make us bad people, or when we try to eliminate them through force of will. The alternative approach involves developing what we might call emotional hospitality, the capacity to welcome whatever feelings arise without immediately trying to change them or use them as evidence for stories about our character. This doesn't mean acting on every emotion or believing that all feelings are equally valid guides for behavior. Rather, it means creating internal space where emotions can be acknowledged, understood, and allowed to complete their natural cycles without interference. Most emotions, when neither suppressed nor indulged, have natural lifespans that are much shorter than we typically imagine. Anger often dissolves within minutes if we neither feed it with justifying thoughts nor try to push it away. Sadness frequently transforms into something else, perhaps gratitude, acceptance, or renewed energy, when we allow it to be fully felt without resistance. Even anxiety often contains valuable information about what we care about and can guide us toward appropriate action when we listen to it without being overwhelmed by it. This emotional fluidity becomes possible when we recognize that we are not our emotions, we are the awareness within which emotions arise and pass away. This recognition doesn't happen through intellectual understanding alone, but through repeated direct experience of noticing emotions as they come and go. Each time we observe an emotion without being completely identified with it, we strengthen our capacity to respond consciously rather than react automatically. As you rest there in the gentle darkness, you might notice this principle operating naturally in your own experience. Thoughts and feelings arise in your awareness, perhaps comfort, curiosity, drowsiness, or restlessness. without your having to do anything to create them or make them disappear. They simply appear, linger for a while, and fade away on their own, replaced by other thoughts and feelings in an endless, natural flow. This observational capacity is what contemplative traditions call witness consciousness, and it's remarkably healing to discover that this neutral, compassionate awareness is always available, regardless of what particular thoughts or emotions we're experiencing. When we're identified with difficult emotions, they seem to define our entire reality. But when we can observe them from this witness perspective, they become simply one aspect of our current experience rather than the totality of who we are. Developing stable access to this witness consciousness is perhaps the most practical gift we can give ourselves. It doesn't eliminate difficult experiences, but it provides a refuge within them, a place of stability from which we can respond more wisely to whatever challenges arise. This stability becomes particularly valuable during what Dostoevsky called the dark nights of the soul, periods when our usual sources of meaning and direction seem unavailable, and we're forced to confront fundamental questions about purpose and identity. These dark nights often occur during major life transitions, career changes, relationship endings, health challenges, or simply the natural passages of aging, when the structures that previously gave our lives meaning no longer seem adequate. During such periods, our old ways of understanding ourselves and our place in the world may feel hollow or irrelevant, but new sources of meaning haven't yet emerged to replace them. Dostoevsky understood these transitional periods not as signs that something has gone wrong, but as natural and necessary phases in the development of consciousness. Just as physical growth sometimes involves awkward stages where we haven't yet adapted to new proportions, psychological and spiritual growth often includes periods of disorientation where our previous identity feels too small, but our new identity hasn't fully formed. The temptation during such periods is often to rush toward resolution, to quickly adopt new beliefs, make dramatic life changes, or force ourselves back into familiar patterns that no longer fit. But Dostoevsky's psychology suggests that these transitional spaces, while uncomfortable, often contain exactly the conditions needed for deeper growth. When our usual ways of defining ourselves are temporarily unavailable, we have the opportunity to discover more authentic expressions of who we're becoming. This requires what we might call the courage of not knowing, the willingness to rest in uncertainty without immediately grasping for new certainties. It means staying present with questions rather than rushing toward answers, allowing confusion to be confused without forcing clarity, trusting that understanding will emerge naturally when we're ready to receive it. This patience with our own unfolding process reflects a deeper trust in what Dostoevsky called the wisdom of life itself, the recognition that consciousness has its own intelligence that often surpasses our conscious understanding. Just as our bodies know how to heal wounds without our having to direct the process consciously, our psyches seem to have innate capacities for integration, growth, and healing that work best when we don't interfere with them too much. This doesn't mean becoming passive or avoiding responsibility for our choices and actions. Rather, it involves learning to distinguish between helpful effort and counterproductive striving, between appropriate action and anxious controlling. Sometimes the most helpful thing we can do is to create supportive conditions and then allow natural processes to unfold. Other times, conscious choice and deliberate action are exactly what's needed. The wisdom lies in developing the sensitivity to recognize which response each situation calls for. This sensitivity grows through experience and attention rather than through following predetermined rules. Each situation is unique and requires us to sense freshly what it needs from us. Sometimes we need to push ourselves beyond our comfort zones. Other times we need to rest and receive. Sometimes we need to speak our truth clearly. Other times we need to listen deeply. Sometimes we need to maintain firm boundaries. Other times we need to soften and allow greater intimacy. This contextual responsiveness is what Dostoevsky meant by living truth as opposed to abstract truth. Abstract truths can be stated as general principles, but living truth emerges through the specific application of wisdom to particular circumstances. It requires not just understanding, but embodied intelligence that can sense what each moment needs and respond accordingly. The development of this embodied intelligence happens gradually through what we might call conscious living, bringing greater awareness to the countless small choices we make throughout each day, how we respond to interruptions, what tone of voice we use when we're tired, whether we really listen when someone is speaking, how we treat ourselves when we make mistakes. These seemingly minor moments gradually shape our character more significantly than dramatic decisions or peak experiences. From this perspective, every ordinary interaction becomes an opportunity to practice consciousness, compassion, and authentic response. The conversation with a difficult colleague becomes a chance to practice patience and clear communication. The daily commute becomes time for mindfulness or reflection. The routine tasks of maintaining our homes and caring for our bodies become opportunities to practice presence and gratitude. This transformation of ordinary life into spiritual practice doesn't require special techniques or extraordinary circumstances. It simply involves bringing the same quality of attention and intentionality to routine activities that we might bring to formal meditation or prayer. When we approach daily life with this kind of reverent attention, the boundary between sacred and secular begins to dissolve. Dostoevsky was particularly interested in how this sacred approach to ordinary life affects our relationships with others. When we're present and attentive in our interactions, people often feel seen and valued in ways that create space for greater authenticity and connection. Our willingness to really listen, to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively, to extend patience with others' limitations and contradictions. These simple practices often have profound effects on the quality of our relationships. The night continues its patient embrace around us, and perhaps you can feel how these ideas naturally translate into the quality of presence you're bringing to this moment. There's no need to perform listening correctly or achieve any particular state of understanding. Simply allowing these concepts to wash over you with gentle attention is itself a practice of the conscious receptivity that Dostoevsky understood as fundamental to wisdom and growth. This receptive awareness is always available, regardless of our external circumstances or internal states. Whether we're experiencing clarity or confusion, peace or agitation, joy or sorrow, the capacity to simply notice what's present with kindness remains constant. This noticing doesn't require us to change or fix anything. It simply offers a stable foundation from which we can respond more consciously to whatever arises. From this foundation of present moment awareness, all personal development becomes not a matter of forcing ourselves to be different, but of gradually removing the obstacles that prevent our natural wisdom and compassion from expressing themselves freely. Like removing weeds from a garden, the work involves identifying and gently releasing the patterns of thought and behavior that no longer serve our growth, rather than trying to force new qualities to appear. These obstructive patterns often include the very self-improvement strategies we've learned to rely on: harsh self-criticism, perfectionist standards, comparison with others, impatience with our own pace of growth. When we can recognize these patterns with compassion rather than judgment, they often begin to lose their grip on us naturally. We don't have to fight them or overcome them through willpower. We simply need to see them clearly and choose more skillful responses when they arise. This gentle approach to personal change reflects Dostoevsky's understanding that lasting transformation occurs through love rather than through force. We can't bully ourselves into becoming better people, but we can create conditions of internal kindness and acceptance that allow our better angels to emerge naturally. This requires treating ourselves with the same patience and understanding we would offer a good friend who was struggling with similar challenges. As sleep begins to call more insistently, drawing you toward whatever rest awaits, allow yourself to settle into this spirit of gentle self-acceptance. There's nothing you need to figure out or fix right now, no insights you need to grasp or remember. The darkness itself is teacher enough, holding space for whatever understanding wants to emerge naturally in its own time. The profound wisdom we've explored together about embracing our contradictions, finding meaning through direct engagement rather than abstract understanding, learning to respond consciously rather than react automatically, continues its quiet work in the depths of awareness, not as urgent demands for immediate change, but as seeds of possibility that will grow according to their own natural rhythms. Rest now in the knowledge that your willingness to engage with these deep questions about human nature and authentic living is itself a form of spiritual practice. The very fact that you're drawn to explore what it means to live consciously demonstrates that the process of awakening is already happening naturally. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to embody whatever wisdom has taken root. But for now, there is only this gentle breathing, this soft letting go, this peaceful surrender to whatever dreams or silence await you in the patient embrace of night. And so, dear traveller, as we reach the end of our journey through Dostoevsky's profound understanding of human nature, we find ourselves not with easy answers, but with something far more valuable, a deeper appreciation for the beautiful complexity of being human. We've wandered through the shadows of the underground, witnessed the struggles of characters wrestling with freedom and responsibility, and discovered that our greatest suffering often contains the seeds of our deepest wisdom. Perhaps what emerges most clearly from this exploration is the recognition that we are not broken beings in need of fixing, but conscious creatures learning to navigate existence with greater skill and compassion. Our contradictions, our struggles, our moments of darkness, these are not flaws to be eliminated, but essential aspects of what makes us beautifully, mysteriously human. Dostoevsky's dark wisdom reminds us that transformation happens not through force or perfection, but through patient engagement with reality as it actually is. In accepting our limitations, we discover our freedom. In embracing uncertainty, we find authentic ground. In loving ourselves and others with all our contradictions intact, we participate in something larger and more meaningful than our individual lives. As the night wraps around you like a gentle embrace, let these insights settle naturally into the quiet spaces of your awareness. There's no urgency to apply them immediately, no pressure to become someone different by morning. The darkness is patient, consciousness is kind, and wisdom works best when allowed to unfold in its own time. Sleep peacefully, knowing that in wrestling with these profound questions, you join the eternal human conversation about what it means to live with awareness and love. Sweet dreams, fellow seeker. May you rest well in the knowledge that even your struggles are sacred, and that tomorrow offers new opportunities to practice the gentle art of being consciously, courageously, authentically human.